All right, let's get right into a case that is a real head-scratcher. On the surface, it seems totally simple, but underneath, it's this incredible legal puzzle. It's about a man who gets married twice, but was he actually guilty of a crime? The answer, which came from the Supreme Court of India, is probably not what you're expecting.
So here's the timeline, the basic, rock-solid facts of the case. In 1956, a man named Bhaurao Lokhande gets legally married to his first wife in Dubai. Simple enough. Then 6 years later, in 1962, while in Dubai is very much still his wife, he goes through a whole other marriage ceremony with a second woman, Kamla Bai. His first wife, understandably, files a criminal complaint. And this whole thing winds its way up through the courts until 1965, when it lands in front of the Supreme Court.
And that right there is the big question, isn't it? The question that's at the heart of this entire explainer. He had a wife, he went through a ceremony to marry a second woman. I mean, that sounds like a textbook, open and shut case of bigamy. So how on earth could he not be guilty? Well, to figure this out, we need to assemble a few puzzle pieces, starting with the law itself.
Okay, first piece of the puzzle, we have to understand what the law actually calls bigamy. What does the criminal code say?
Now let's look at the actual wording here, because it's everything. Section 494 of the Indian Penal Code says, if you have a living spouse and you, and here it is, the magic word, marries another person, you've committed a crime. Now that word marries seems so obvious, right? But as you're about to see, the entire case spins on the precise legal meaning of that one single word. So you can see the prosecution's point of view, right? It seems totally straightforward. Bhaurao had a wife, he went through a second marriage ceremony, so he married again. Case closed. But the defense came back with a completely different argument, and to understand it, we need to look at a totally different law. Let's move to our next puzzle piece and see how this all connects. Before you can decide if someone committed the crime of bigamy, you first have to figure out what the law considers a marriage to be. And for that, the court had to turn to the Hindu Marriage Act. This is where things get a little technical, but stick with me because it's super important. Section 7 of the Hindu Marriage Act makes it clear that a marriage isn't just a party or a social agreement. To be legally real, it has to be solemnized. And what that means is that it has to follow very specific customary rites and ceremonies. If you don't do those ceremonies, then in the eyes of the law, you don't have a legally recognized marriage.
So, what are these essential ceremonies? Well, for most traditional Hindu marriages, the law zooms in on two that are absolutely critical. First, the homa. That's the invocation before a sacred fire. And second, the saptapadi. The saptapadi is where the bride and groom take 7 steps together around that fire. And here's the real kicker. The law explicitly says the marriage is legally complete and binding only when that 7th step is taken, not a second sooner.
Okay, so we've got the criminal law and we've got the marriage law. Now we need the final piece, the one that connects them, the legal bridge that the Supreme Court used to solve this entire mystery. And here it is, Section 17 of the Hindu Marriage Act. This is the section that directly connects a second marriage to the crime of bigamy we saw earlier. But look really closely at the wording. It doesn't just say any second marriage. It says any second marriage that is solemnized. Boom. There it is again, that same specific, technical word linking the crime of bigamy directly to the proper legal performance of the marriage ceremonies.
This slide just lays it out perfectly. You had 2 totally different stories being told in court. The prosecution was basically saying, come on, look at the social reality. They had a ceremony, they acted like they were married, that's enough. But the defense came back with a purely legal argument. They said it doesn't matter one bit what it looked like. The only question is, did they perform the legally essential rites? Specifically, was the saptapadi performed? Because if it wasn't, there was no legally valid second marriage at all.
So, with all these pieces on the table, all these arguments, how did the Supreme Court finally put it all together and reach its decision? The court's entire reasoning can be boiled down to this one, single, powerful sentence from the judgment. If the marriage is not a valid marriage, it is no marriage in the eye of law. That was it. That was the key that unlocked the whole thing. What society thinks doesn't matter. What the strict letter of the law says, that's everything. So let's just walk through the court's thinking step by step. 1. For bigamy to be a crime, that second marriage has to be legally valid. 2. A valid marriage needs to be solemnized with those essential ceremonies, like saptapadi. 3. The prosecution, in this case, completely failed to prove that those ceremonies ever actually happened. Which means, 4. Without a legally valid, solemnized second marriage, there was no marriage in the eyes of the law. And the final step? If there's no second marriage, there simply can be no crime of bigamy.
And so, the final verdict came down. Bhaurao Lokhande was found not guilty. He and his brother were acquitted of all charges. Even though he went through a second marriage ceremony, in the eyes of the law, he hadn't committed a crime.
So you might be thinking, okay, that's a wild case, but it's from 1965. Why are we still talking about it? Well, because its legacy is huge, and it's kind of a double-edged sword, raising questions we are still dealing with today. On one hand, you could see this ruling as a massive win for legal certainty. It hammered home a core principle of criminal justice. The law has to be incredibly strict and precise. To convict someone of a crime, the prosecution has to prove every single tiny element of that crime. If even one technical ingredient is missing, like proof that a ceremony happened, then you can't have a conviction, period.
But, and this is a huge but, there's the other side of the coin. This ruling created a massive loophole with really serious social consequences. It means that a woman, like Kamalabai in this case, could be a wife in every single social way, living with a man, being seen by everyone as his wife, but legally she has zero rights or protections if some key ceremony was skipped. No right to maintenance, no inheritance, nothing. She's left completely out in the cold.
And that leaves us with this really tough final question. This case is the perfect example of the clash between the strict formal rules of law and the messy, complicated reality of people's lives. When what society sees as a marriage and what the law demands for a marriage are two different things, which one should win? It's a question that courts are still wrestling with, and it all comes back to this one fascinating puzzle from over 60 years ago.